folks, and welcome to the second event of the Research Forum for 2022-23, Engaged English. And today we are delighted to be able to welcome the Helen Clara Dolman Visiting Professor in English, Dr. Alan Macduffie, to share his work and knowledge and expertise with us today. I'd like to begin by recognizing that Queen's University occupies territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and that I am a settler and uninvited guest on this territory and have been for the majority of my adult life. I also want to note that Friday of this week is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and I encourage everyone to reflect on the ways in which you can contribute to these difficult, vital, and mutually informing enterprises of truth and reconciliation for which Indigenous survivors of residential schooling and many others have struggled for many years. A couple of events coming up as part of the Research Forum engage in questions around truth and reconciliation in various ways, and I want to bring those to your attention. On November 8th, another Tuesday in this room, 2:30 to 4, we will be hosting Nisga'a poet and scholar Dr. Jordan Abel as the Joanne Page Lecturer for this year. And Jordan will be presenting a talk entitled "The Page as Material as Land, an Artist Talk on Empty Spaces." And then following that talk, the next iteration of our Research Forum will be from Anishinaabe scholar and pre-doctoral fellow in Indigenous Studies and English here at Queen's, Johanna Bird. So this is November 22nd, 2:30 to 4, and Johanna will be presenting a talk entitled "Reading Texts in Place, Revisiting Treaty 4." So those events are on the horizon. Even sooner than those events will be the next event in the Research Forum, which will be the Sister Sophie Lecture. We have two of those over the course of the year, one in the fall term, one in the winter. The fall term Sister Sophie Lecture will be delivered by Dr. Daniel Heller-Rosen, Professor of Comparative Lit at Princeton, and this will be October 18th, 2:30 to 4. The talk will be called "3 Ways of Being Nobody." It's a very provocative title there. I'm going to pass around the sign-in sheet for the students in the 803-903 course, so please provide your initials on that sheet when it comes your way. And then last bit of business before I hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Ranjani Chatterjee, to introduce our speaker. The talk today is about 45 minutes-ish. We'll have probably 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. And then I'm sure that there will be more that people want to ask and talk about. So we can informally convene for a little bit of a casual conversation after the talk proper. So please make yourselves available for that, and I will pass things over to Dr. Chatterjee.
Great, so good afternoon everyone. I'm Dr. Chatterjee. I'm Assistant Professor of English here at Queen's, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alan Macduffie. So Professor Macduffie is Helen Clara Dolman Visiting Professor of English at Queen's and Associate Professor of English at the University of Texas, Austin. His first book, Victorian Literature, Energy and the Ecological Imagination, explores how Victorian fiction by Dickens, John Ruskin, Joseph Conrad, Robert Louis Stevenson, and H.G. Wells helped create an environmental consciousness by articulating questions about sustainable energy use. And the monograph won the 2014 Sonia Rudikoff Prize from the Northeast Victorian Studies Association. And he's recently edited a special issue of Texas Studies in Language and Literature in 2020 on Victorian environments. And his work has been published in PMLA, Victorian Studies, Representations, and many other venues. Those are only a few names. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Macduffie.
Thanks, Ranjani, and thanks to Sam. I'm really happy to be here at Queen's this year. I've had just such a great time, and I just want to say how grateful I am to everyone for the warm welcome I've gotten here so far. Because this lecture series, I know, is part of a class for graduate students, I wanted to say just a few things about the origins of this project. It started as a conference paper back in 2017, and now is an almost complete book manuscript. Working on that. But for me, that was always a mystery of the whole process. How people arrived at their ideas, when you knew, like when you had an idea, when the idea you had, is this a conference paper? Is it a dissertation? Is it a chapter? Is it an article? Is it half a dissertation? Like, what is it? I still don't really know how to figure that out, but I've always found it useful to hear from other people how they've arrived at their ideas, what the story is behind them. So for whatever it's worth, I will say a few words about that now. And then, of course, any questions you might have, I'd be happy to talk more about that afterwards. So this book project began with a conundrum. And the conundrum is that Charles Darwin is probably the most important thinker in the history of the science of ecology. He theorized the complex interconnections between habitats, organisms, and wider environmental conditions, and thought very deeply about the ways in which very small changes to an ecosystem can have profound changes over time. And yet, Darwin was not really seen as much of a green thinker in the 19th century. In fact, as Nancy Steppen writes, Darwin drew no larger conclusions about from his knowledge of interdependency, and remained unconcerned about conservation issues. So for a long time in my field, which is Victorian studies generally, and Victorian eco-criticism, I guess more specifically, Darwin barely factored in discussions of the 19th century ecological imaginary. Instead, the focus was on people like Charles Dickens, John Ruskin, William Morris, Gerard Manley Hopkins, people who either seemed not all that influenced by Darwin, or were actually actively kind of hostile toward him, like Ruskin was. So that was the question that got this whole project started. What was it about Darwin's ideas and the way they were discussed that made them perhaps the most important ecological figure in the history of Western ecological thought, and yet somehow seemingly beside the point when it came to discussing the period's environmental imagination and politics? So, and the reason, I think, has something to do with the denialism, the greeted arguments about evolution in the Victorian period. But it's not the form of denialism that we usually think of. Not the kind of outright rejection practiced by creationists, conservative members of the Victorian scientific establishment. Not that story. Instead, I think it has something to do with a more quieter and more equivocal form of science denialism. It was absolutely widespread in the culture, but that often gets overshadowed by the brazen and absurd antics of many of the outspoken religious opponents of evolution. I'm talking about a form of denial characterized not by open rejection, but by a kind of deliberate forgetting, pushing out of mind, a kind of knowing and not knowing at the same time. It's what Freud calls disavowal, or what Naomi Klein has recently called soft denial, a word that captures the kind of strategically flexible relationship we might have to things that we do know, but wish we didn't. Such a contradictory structure of feeling is characteristic of a culture both trying to come to terms with and struggling to avoid the reality of its relationship to the natural world and its situation on this planet. So in what follows, I'm going to discuss this form of denialism as it makes itself felt in the response to evolutionary science in the literature of the period. And I want to argue that it's not just a structure of feeling that kind of shows up in Victorian literature, but it was actually provided a kind of complex and multi-dimensional formal resource for many of the novelists and poets who wanted to explore these ideas but were unsure how they fit into the picture of reality being painted by the culture. Then in the second section, I want to turn my attention to Thomas Henry Huxley to suggest some of the ways in which this denialism worked its way into the very articulation of Darwinian ideas by some of the most important evolutionary scientists of the day. And then in the last short section, and it is short, so when we get to the third section, don't be like, oh my god, it's not that long. I just want to briefly discuss the legacy of this denial and suggest some connections we might draw between this response to Darwin in the 19th century and the denial of climate science today. So, section 1. These are big topics, and so to get us into them, I want to start with something small. This is a letter that Charlotte Bronte wrote to her friend James Taylor in 1851 about a book she just read, and here's what she says. "Of the impression this book has made on me, I will not now say much. It is the first exposition of avowed atheism and materialism I have ever read, the first unequivocal declaration of disbelief in the existence of a God or a future life I have ever seen. One would wish entirely to put aside the sort of instinctive horror these ideas awaken, and to consider them in an impartial spirit and collected mood. This I find difficult to do. Sincerely for my own part do I wish to know and find the truth, but if this be truth, well may she guard herself with mysteries and cover herself with a veil. If this be truth, man or woman who beholds her can but curse the day he or she was born. Read the book then, in an unprejudiced spirit, and candidly say what you think of it. I mean, of course, if you have time." Now, the book she's discussing is the social theorist Harriet Martineau's Letters on the Laws of Man's Nature and Development, which is full of speculations about the origins of the human species and its kinship with other animals. This is 1851, so we're still about 8 years away from the publication of The Origin of Species. But Martineau's book is part of a wider interest that we see in the culture in speculating about evolutionary ideas, that Darwin's work would come along and put on firm scientific footing. And Bronte's reaction to this book is one that we see again and again in the period. It's a form of denial, but it's certainly not what we usually mean when we use the phrase science denial. Bronte doesn't reject Martineau's argument or criticize her reasoning. She doesn't appeal to scripture or fall back on the argument from design. Her concern, in fact, is not that Martineau's book is wrong and has to be refuted, but that it's right and has to be managed. Bronte isn't so much responding to Martineau's book as responding to her response to it, consciously, self-consciously arranging her own relationship to what she knows or what she might know about the natural world and the human place within it. So as I said in the opening, disavowal, in the way I'm talking about it, was first discussed by Freud, but maybe the classic expression of it comes from the French psychoanalyst Octave Manoni, and his expression, "I know very well, all the same," which suggests not just that two opposing positions are held, but that the person holding them might be acutely aware of the contradiction, might even say it out loud. To put it paradoxically, disavowal is the admission of denial. So it's characterized by unresolved tension, doubleness, recursivity, and all of those things we can see running through Bronte's letter and its different expressions of cross-purpose desires. Bronte makes much of Martineau's rhetorical posture, her willingness to declare and avow, her unequivocal, that is, single-voiced position, whereas what Bronte wants is to keep open multiple conflicting voices, to defer judgment and to disavow. We can see a similar reaction in a much more famous example, maybe the century's most famous example of a response to evolutionary science, Tennyson's In Memoriam. There, the poet, of course, famously describes nature red in tooth and claw, that vivid image of natural violence that for many would become the lyric distillation of the entire Darwinian point of view. Like Bronte, Tennyson's speaker is concerned not really with the truth or falsehood of this picture, but what a person is supposed to do once he has encountered it. So he asks in the next stanza, what hope of answer or redress? And the answer he gives is Bronte's, behind the veil, behind the veil. Now, to my ears, The preposition behind, repeated this way, inflects the line with just a hint of the imperative. That is, one way to find the answer to this anguished question is to put the answer behind the veil. Not just take comfort in what one doesn't know, but to seek not knowing as a form of consolation. And the doubling of that phrase at the end suggests the way language itself, as sound, as form, can function as a screen or a veil, with the repetition transforming the words from proposition to incantation. Tennyson, it seems to me, is incredibly self-aware of the way the forces of desire and aversion shape his beliefs. Elsewhere, he says about the prospect of extinction, "I cannot think the thing farewell." And in telling us about what he cannot, rather than does not think, he reveals the willfulness in his refusal, the need that motivates belief. The same is true with his discussion of human animality in a later canto. "Let him, the wiser man who springs hereafter, up from childhood shape his action like the greater ape. But I was born to other things." The sociologist Kay Anderson writes, "What is fascinating about this period is that the full implications of the fact of human-animal evolutionary continuity appears not to have been fully drawn out or confronted. The felt sense of categorical distinction persisted." And to me, In Memoriam takes as its subject that gap between fact and feeling, and the problem of not knowing how to think or feel about that gap. The felt sense of distinction is powerfully compelling, and yet that also means it cannot entirely be trusted. That italicized "born" in the last line, and that emphasis is in the original, suggests a kind of defiance. But whether that defiance is a kind of ennobling self-assertion or a defensive refusal is left open. And I don't think Tennyson himself quite knows which one it is. Or to take it a step further, whether there actually is a difference between those two things, defiant self-assertion or defensive refusal. Because if rejecting your animal nature keeps you from behaving like an ape, then does the fiction, no matter how false it is, in some sense become true? As the novelist John Fowles puts it, we are all on a flight from the real reality. That is a basic definition of Homo sapiens. In other words, the reality of being human is constituted by the rejection of the reality of being human. What sets the species apart is the uniqueness of its demand to be unique. Here, as throughout the poem, Tennyson allows his line to voice these oppositional possibilities, to open up an uncertain zone where the expression of belief and the verbal performance of belief cannot be differentiated. So the disavowal of evolutionary science in Memoriam is complex and pervasive, but often quiet, conveyed through vocal inflections, subtle shadings of tone and meaning. I want to turn now to a text where disavowal and its social and political implications are much more openly on display, and that's H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Now, The Time Machine is all about a trip to a distant future world that reveals the operations of Darwinian forces in that world. Specifically, the transformation of Homo sapiens into two new species, Eloi and Morlocks. Now that change comes about because of a complex tangle of ecological pressures that the time traveler spends the whole story figuring out. The relationship between competitive struggle, morphology, and environmental conditions by which the human species has unraveled itself. Now the time traveler describes this extinction event in harrowing detail, but the novel is actually narrated by a frame narrator who closes the book by considering what he is supposed to do now with this knowledge he has, and his response is to decide he's going to pretend he doesn't have it. I, for my own part, cannot think that these latter days of weak experiment, fragmentary theory, and mutual discord are indeed man's culminating time. I say for my own part, the time traveler thought but cheerlessly of the advancement of mankind and saw in the growing pile of civilization only a foolish heaping that must inevitably fall back upon and destroy its makers in the end. If that is so, it remains for us to live as though it were not so. Note the echo of Tennyson there, describing what he cannot think. rather than does nothing. But more importantly, note that perfect encapsulation of disavowal in the final line. The narrator doesn't reject the future vision or the science behind it. Instead, he chooses to live as though it were not so, to actively pretend things are other than they are. And it's completely unclear what motivates this, whether he just can't handle these ideas emotionally, or whether he thinks, as a social and political matter, we're better off not knowing that we face certain doom. But that uncertainty, I think, is the whole point. We are left wondering, is the narrator's denial of the coming catastrophe precisely the kind of response that will ensure that catastrophe happens? Or is refusing to understand the future as already written the only position that makes an alternative future possible? Are forms of personal meaning-making just a retreat into the very individualist ethos that helped create the problem in the first place? Or is the problem so incalculably vast that keeping a sphere of human meaning is a justifiable and maybe even necessary response, no matter how much of a falsification it also is? These questions, I would venture to say, are familiar to anyone who has struggled to make sense of questions of complicity and agency in the Anthropocene, or sought to define what a meaningful life looks like in the midst of an unfolding climate catastrophe. Like in Memoriam, the time machine works at the meeting place of incommensurable realities and scales, where the life of the individual and the life history of the species seem to have no means of integration, no common frame, no language to bridge their opposed but equally true realities. In some ways, I think this is the real uncharted territory of Wells' novel, the place where the impersonal and the personal, the living present moment and the conjured far-off future, conviction, desire, pass in and out of each other in fluid and necessarily obscure ways. Disavowal, Freud says, is artful. And in Tennyson and Wells, we find complex formal effects generated at the impasse where the human, the non-human, and the all-too-human make their competing claims on the real. These effects, I would argue, present us with something notably distinct from so-called unreliable narration, because the point is not to measure these claims against some commonly accepted, reliable version of reality, but to make plain how there is no such thing anymore. That every valid claim of the real seems to entail the deliberate refusal of another. So,